A woman is driving home from work listening to a podcast about reinvention, freedom, simplicity, or starting over. And for a brief moment, she feels something open inside her. Not necessarily a dramatic dream, just a quiet recognition, realization that part of her wants life to feel different than it currently does. Maybe slower or calmer, more meaningful, or even more connected. Maybe less emotionally exhausting. And almost immediately, another voice appears. You should be more grateful. Other people have it harder. You already have a good life. Why would you want more? And what's interesting about that internal conflict is many women have spent so many years organizing life around responsibility, stability, and other people's needs that even wanting something different can trigger guilt. Not because the desire itself is wrong, but because somewhere along the way, many people learned to associate wanting with selfishness, especially if their current life appears functional from the outside. That's important because midlife often awakens desires people spent years suppressing, not necessarily material desires, more existential ones. The desire for peace, the desire for emotional spaciousness, the desire to stop performing constantly, the desire for more meaningful work, more rest, more creativity, more honesty, more presence, more freedom over how daily life actually feels. And honestly, I think many women quietly minimize those desires before they even fully allow themselves to explore them. Because the nervous system often interprets change as risk, especially after years spent building safety through predictability. So people remain inside lives that technically function while privately feeling emotionally disconnected from parts of themselves. Not because they're weak, because humans adapt. That's what the nervous system does. It adapts to environments, roles, expectations, survival patterns, and over time, adaptation can become so normalized that people stop questioning whether the life they've adapted to still genuinely fits them anymore. There's actually research in psychology around self-silencing, which describes the tendency to suppress personal needs, preferences, emotions, or desires in order to maintain connection, approval, or stability. And while self-silencing can happen in many contexts, women are often heavily socialized towards accommodation, emotional caretaking, and relational harmony. So many women become highly skilled at suppressing themselves in subtle ways, not dramatically, quietly. You stop voicing your preferences, you tolerate dynamics that drain you, you stay overly responsible, you continue performing versions of yourself that no longer fully feel authentic. You convince yourself your exhaustion is normal. And eventually the nervous system starts sending signals: restlessness, emotional numbness, irritability, difficulty feeling fully present, the sense that life looks fine externally, it doesn't fully feel alive internally. And what's difficult is many people interpret those signals as ingratitude. But wanting a different life is not necessarily rejection of your current one. Sometimes it's recognition that your nervous system is asking for a different way of living. That distinction matters because there's a difference between being unhappy and being internally misaligned. A person can deeply love their family and still feel emotionally exhausted by the pace of their life. A person can appreciate what they've built and still recognize that certain patterns no longer feel sustainable. A person can feel grateful and still want more authenticity, more calm, more emotional connection, more freedom. Humans are complex enough to hold multiple truths simultaneously. But I think that many women were conditioned to believe that wanting more peace, more space, more fulfillment, or honesty somehow means we're failing to appreciate what we already have. So instead of listening to themselves, they suppress the desire, and suppression creates psychological tension because the nervous system is constantly responding to lived emotional reality. even when the conscious mind tries minimizing it. That's one reason people sometimes feel emotionally tired in ways they cannot fully explain. Part of them has been continuously overriding themselves, continuously adapting and negotiating against their own internal truth. And over time, what starts happening is the gap between external life and internal longing quietly widens. That widening creates friction, not because people are dramatic, because humans are not designed to permanently disconnect from themselves. And I honestly think midlife often becomes the season where suppressed desires finally become louder, not because people suddenly become reckless, but because the nervous system becomes less willing to tolerate chronic self abandonment. The body changes, energy changes, our priorities change. People begin recognizing that time is finite in a more emotional, real way. And once that awareness deepens, many women begin reevaluating how they actually want to live, not according to internet culture, not according to everyone else's expectations, their actual life, their actual nervous system, and their actual emotional reality. And what's interesting about this stage is the desires themselves are often surprisingly simple. People want slower mornings, more presence, less emotional chaos, more reciprocal relationships, work that feels meaningful, and homes that feel calming, schedules that leave room to breathe, conversations that feel honest, time to think and time to rest, time to reconnect with parts of themselves that got buried underneath years of constant responsibility. That's not selfish, it's humanity. And I think a lot of people underestimate how emotionally sealing it can be to simply admit this version of life no longer fully works for me. Not from a place of blame, from honesty, because honesty creates movement. Suppression creates stagnation. And what's difficult is many women immediately begin negotiating against their own desires once awareness appears. It's too late. It's unrealistic. I should be satisfied. Other people need me. What if I disappoint everyone? The nervous system naturally anticipates risk. When change threatens familiar structures, even unhealthy familiarity can feel psychologically safer than uncertainty. That's important to understand because many people wait for certainty before allowing themselves to make meaningful shifts. But certainty rarely arrives first. Usually, it's awareness that arrives first, then discomfort, then honesty, then smaller decisions that gradually begin changing the emotional structure of life. And honestly, I think that social media often confuses people about what change actually looks like. People imagine reinvention must be dramatic. Quit the job, move across the country, completely start over. But meaningful change often unfolds much more quietly. You protect your peace differently. You stop automatically overcommitting. You become more selective with relationships. You create healthier pacing and you simplify your life. You stop organizing every decision around external approval and you allow yourself to evolve. And over time, those smaller decisions begin changing how life feels internally. That's one reason values based living research consistently shows improvement in emotional well being. The nervous system experiences greater coherence when behavior aligns more honestly with internal values, not because life becomes perfect, but because internal conflict decreases. And I honestly think that many women are quietly craving coherence more than achievement now. They want lives that feel emotionally sustainable, not just externally impressive. That changes priorities because eventually there comes a point where people realize they do not want to spend the second half of life permanently exhausted while trying to maintain versions of themselves that no longer feel true. They want lives with more emotional integrity, presence, steadiness, more freedom to actually connect with themselves again. I've noticed this in my own life too. There are moments where I suddenly realize that certain goals, rhythms, or expectations I carried for years no longer feel emotionally aligned with who I am becoming now. And what's interesting is how easy it is to initially resist that awareness, because changing direction, even internally, requires grieving old identities, expectations, old timelines, definitions of success. But eventually, honesty becomes less exhausting than pretending. And I think that's where many women are arriving emotionally, not necessarily wanting to abandon their entire life, but wanting to participate in it more consciously, truthfully, and intentionally. Because there's a deep difference between surviving your life and actually feeling connected to it. And maybe that's part of what this season of life is really inviting people to do. Not selfishness or recklessness, but reconnection. The willingness to acknowledge that your nervous system, your emotional reality, your desires, and your humanity matter too. That wanting peace does not make you lazy. That wanting more honesty does not make you ungrateful. That wanting a different rhythm of life does not make you selfish. It makes you aware. And awareness changes things, because once people stop shaming themselves for wanting something different, they begin making decisions differently. They become more intentional with time, more selective with energy, and more honest about what no longer feels sustainable. And then gradually, life starts reorganizing around greater alignment. Not perfectly and not instantly, but honestly. And maybe that's enough. Maybe real growth is not becoming someone entirely different. Maybe it's finally allowing yourself to acknowledge what your nervous system has been trying to tell you for years. That you're allowed to want a life that feels more peaceful and connected, more emotionally sustainable, and more fully your own. So maybe instead of asking, should I want something different? A more supportive question might be, what kind of life would allow me to feel more emotionally alive, honest, and connected moving forward? Because sometimes healing begins the moment people stop apologizing internally for their own desires. And over time, that honesty changes everything, not through dramatic reinvention, but through smaller decisions that slowly create a life the nervous system no longer has to fight so hard to survive. If this episode resonated with you, make sure you subscribe to Clarity Reset. And if you want additional tools to help you reconnect with clarity and intentionally shape the next season of your life, I'll leave the Clarity Reset resources below. And until next time, remember that wanting a different life does not make you selfish. Sometimes it simply means you're finally listening to yourself honestly.